But then when they choose something, sometimes they won't do what's in their own best interest because they finally made a decision or a choice and now they feel trapped by it. So this can be a function that is actually quite undermining to ENTPs. They might be highly charismatic and fun and have a good vibe with people, but then find themselves also being people pleasers or handing too much of their mimetic power over to others. So which all creates obstructions to feeling self-love, right? If you won't leave a bad situation, it's really easy for your brain to go, well, maybe you don't feel like you deserve to.
Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this week we are continuing our series. We're doing all 16 Myers-Briggs personality types in this series, and we're talking about how each type can love themselves using an understanding of their personality type as an access point. So we want to go through today and talk about the ENTP personality type and how ENTPs, whether you are an ENTP watching or listening right now, or you have an ENTP in your life, as I do, how an ENTP can actually show themselves love. And so, Antonia, your best fit type preferences are ENTP. That's why I mentioned if you have one in your life, like myself.
That's right. If you got a token ENTP in your life.
I actually have 2 ENTPs in my life.
You do.
Very close to me. My oldest son, Gunnar, who's around 18 years old at the time of this recording, is also ENTP preferences. Mm-hmm. So I have stereo.
Yeah.
ENTP stereo in my home.
Yeah. And man,
oh man, sometimes it's rough.
That was incredibly convenient because when I became your boy's stepmother, they were like 3 and 5.
Yeah.
And we had no idea what their type was. And I was really nervous. And then Gunnar, the older, ended up having ENTP preferences. And that could not have, I feel like I won the lottery on that one.
I feel like I won the lottery because I can understand my son so much. I've got an interpreter right here that can, I mean, had I raised Gunnar without you as like my, like my wingman basically in raising a child, we do not understand each other all the time. Like he thinks very differently than I do. And he's got a whole different thing going on. And he I'm like, oh, a more emotion will help you understand this. And that doesn't work, right? Like, so all the things that I've had to figure out in a relationship with you has helped me with my son so much. So it's also been beneficial for me.
Yeah.
As a dad.
I think it worked out. I think it worked out for the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we're talking about self-love, how to show your self-love from the ENTP perspective. Couple key things to lay down the framework for this. We've been rolling along this series. We did an intro podcast, a few episodes at the very start of the series. Go back and reference that if you haven't heard it. It's a really great framework for what we're going to talk about. But let's just do a quick catch up. So we're approaching loving ourselves from our type in the same way we would approach the framework of a relationship with another person. So just like when you're in a relationship with a lover, a spouse, a partner, a friend, a family member, that relationship gives you a container for love to be sent back and forth. And we believe, myself and Antonia, believe that love is freely given. It should not be conditional. Love is something you express and you give without any condition or requirement for that love to be sent.
Yeah, it's not earned.
That's right. However, a good relationship does have some requirements. It does need to be earned, and it does have some expectations. And if the relationship is broken or there's something wrong with the relationship, that interrupts the signal of love you want to send back and forth between you and another person. So we take that same idea and we just apply it to ourselves. We say, well, you have a relationship with yourself. You should not have to feel like you've got to earn love. Like it's not a reward for doing the right thing. Like, well, I did well, so now I'll show myself love. We want to show ourselves love freely without any requirement, without any conditions. But the relationship with ourselves does impact how the flow of love goes back and forth.
Yeah. Well, to piggyback on that, we are actually showing ourselves love or attempting to show ourselves love all the time.
Yes.
The challenge isn't whether or not we are, like turning the spigot off, right? Like we're like, oh, well, I'm not allowed to love myself because I didn't fill in the blank, whatever one believes is the condition for showing themselves love. It's not that we stop and start showing ourselves love. It's that we're sending ourselves love all the time, but we have all of these obstructions to receiving it.
Signal blocks.
Great phrase. Signal blocks. Exactly. And so the relationship you're talking about, the relationship that is earned, the healthy relationship with ourselves, effectively, that's simply saying removing obstructions from us showing ourselves love.
Yeah.
And when we remove those obstructions, now we like, that's when people say, like, I like myself. Right. Like I learned to love and like myself, or no, I think I'm an okay person, or I deserve good things in life. Right. Like it's like this awareness and awakening around like, oh yeah, I have permission to be me, and I have permission to be this person. And I'm allowed to, I'm allowed to have good things. That's when a person is removing the obstructions to that signal.
Yeah.
And then when we start to receive love from ourselves, that's usually when we want to build the healthiest relationship possible, because we feel the reward of it.
Yeah. So this idea of these blocks, these signal blocks. And then the other idea is when you're in a relationship with somebody, like another person, you have expectations of them and they have expectations of you. Now, these might be spoken explicitly or they're unspoken expectations. Like we have actual like marriage contracts, for example, like you do something legal and get married. That's a very formal expectation you might have with a partner. But there's also verbal contracts or things you talk about. And then there's unspoken expectations in relationships all over the place. All your relationships have these running. Same thing with ourselves. There's explicit and I guess implicit expectations we can have of ourselves. So as we talk about the ENTP personality today, we're going to look at it in that way. These blocks, these signal blocks of love, setting and receiving love to yourself. And then the other core idea is the proper expectations we should have for ourselves. We're going to use personality type to look at that. So as an ENTP, the ENTP is just a 4-letter code that really speaks to how your mind is wired, your cognition, the way you learn information, the way you make decisions. We're going to approach this from the CAR model. We use this CAR model to show cognition for ENTPs, for all types, but ENTPs today. And this basically shows you how your mind is wired. It comes from our owner's manual, our ENTP owner's manual course, which teaches you all about the personality type, how to get into flow, how to get out of loops and grips, all these things. We'll mention some of these things today as we talk. But we're going to pull it from the owner's manual. We're going to reference that today. So just a brief overview of that would be in order. I'm going to go so quick, and I'm a little nervous about going really quick because we're talking to ENTPs most likely, and you're all about accuracy, right? About precision. So forgive me if I'm going to broad brush. I know I'm overgeneralizing a lot of these things quickly, but it's just to catch somebody up maybe that doesn't have the ENTP owner's manual. They're not familiar as much with the CAR model. They just need a quick refresher. So I'm going to go very quickly. I'm going to blitz through it. And Antonia, add any color into the commentary you need to. Okay. If you imagine your mind as a 4-passenger car, I'm just going to speak directly to ENTPs. The driver, you have a driver, a co-pilot. In the back seat, you've got a 10-year-old and a 3-year-old, like a family driving. Imagine these are parts of your mind or parts of your personality moving through the world. The driver for ENTPs is a mental process we've nicknamed exploration. Its technical name is extroverted intuition. It's all about real-time external pattern making, imagination, asking the question, what if, and taking seemingly unconnected things or disconnected things and putting them together to see what connections can happen. This is about possibility thinking, about, all the, what if scenarios that we can see. And this is what moves ENTPs through the world. They love abstract outer pattern recognition. It does a lot more than what I just said, but that's basically the driver for ENTPs.
Yeah, idea generation probably best illustrated in a brainstorming session.
Yes. Right next to that is the co-pilot for ENTPs. Nickname for this process, this mental process, is accuracy. Technical name is introverted thinking. Accuracy is all about precision. It's about data. It's about internal consistent logic. It's about core beliefs, and almost the one way to think about it, if you're not ENTP, this is how I think about it. It's like prime numbers of thought. It's like reducing thought down to their irreducible components. And that's really where you start to build your thinking from, those fundamental components. It's focused in on things like debate and understanding and frameworks. It's got a bunch of things it does. And this is basically how ENTPs make their best decisions using this process. So those two, that driver and co-pilot in the front seat of your car, if you're living your life as an ENTP from those two mental processes, you're living well. You obviously are operating your personality in a good way. And you'll probably have good result in your life. There's some challenging news though. In the back seat, directly behind the co-pilot, is a mental function that we call the 10-year-old. Its nickname is harmony. Technical name, extroverted feeling. It's about the vibe between people, and it's about the understanding of social dynamics, social hierarchies, the relational flow between people, the kind of the common social practices of a social group, all of these things it's tuned into, right? And it has about the maturity or sophistication level, maybe the certainty level of a 10-year-old child. And so that can be interesting inside the ENTP's personality. This can show up in all sorts of ways we're going to talk about in a moment. And then sitting directly behind the driver is a 3-year-old mental process that we've nicknamed memory. Introverted sensing is its technical name. This is about tracking changes over time, about standardization, about sensory impressions and who we have become over time in our relation to the world, and then watching how this happens in a larger scale for society, culture. And this, again, has a sophistication or certainty level for an ENTP about a 3-year-old child. So you can imagine how this might show up in a lot of interesting ways inside this personality. Again, I want to remind you, I just blitzed through those 4 positions in the ENTP CAR model. All of these functions do a lot more than what I said, and all of them influence each other inside of this personality. But that's the map we're going to look through. And then we're going to look at each of the positions, these 4 positions, and talk about the expectations that you as an ENTP can have for yourself in sending yourself love.
Yeah. No, I think that was a good one. I think that was like a nice, good overview of the functions.
Yeah. Any NTP accuracy people are always like, well, this exactly, like they're always really trying to get to the precision of something.
Well,
and I'm more of a understanding, I'm a humanities kind of guy.
It's from Better Call Saul, right?
Yeah. I'm not so into the sciences of it all.
I'm more into the humanities. Actually, I think he said that in Breaking Bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's me being accurate.
See, there you go.
So as you mentioned, relationships are built on healthy expectations. If we have an expectation for somebody that they cannot meet, then all we do is we become disappointed and we demoralize them. If we have low expectations for someone when they can do a lot better, then they feel insulted and we never get to see them rise to the occasion. We never build trust in them and confidence in them. So it requires some discretion, right? What are right expectations that we can create and establish for the person that we're in a relationship with? And that same concept applies to the self as well. When we're creating expectations for ourselves, one of the most, I would say one of the best things that comes out of an understanding of cognitive functions and type is that it gives us like a formula for setting good expectations. It gives us a formula for knowing what kinds of things that we can expect ourselves to do well in, and the areas in which we're only going to become demoralized if we expect ourselves to do better than we're sort of cognitively limited by. As you go down what's called the cognitive function stack, or you just mentioned the CAR model, starting with extroverted intuition and introverted thinking, those 2 functions, we should be setting very high expectations for ourselves. In fact, we can't let ourselves, we can't cut ourselves slack here, because this is the best of us. And just like if you're in a relationship with somebody who you know what they're capable of, but they're sloughing off, they're being lazy, they're kind of letting themselves have an out, well, then you become disappointed in them. You go, well, this is not your best. Why aren't you bringing your best to the relationship? Why aren't you bringing your best to the world? I know there's more in you. I've seen it. It's the exact same mechanism for ourselves. If we are not capitalizing on our best, if we're not building skill in areas that we have natural talent, we're going to be disappointed in ourselves. So the first 2 functions, the driver and the co-pilot, we want to have high expectations for ourselves. When we get to the 10-year-old function, the third, the tertiary, we want to start creating more reasonable expectations for ourselves, because this is a place of uncertainty. And that lack of certainty means that all human beings have a tendency to conflate uncertainty with a red flag. And so any area of ourselves that we experience uncertainty in, we have a tendency to kind of we push that away, or we find coping mechanisms, or we try to create, systems that help us, kind of calm down that feeling. And we do that with our 10-year-old function in a very specific way, and we'll get to that in a moment. But because it's a place of uncertainty, we need to have reasonable expectations. We need to see it as a function that doesn't really ever get more certain than a 10-year-old. And then when you get to the fourth function, the inferior, what we call the 3-year-old, this is a place of deep uncertainty. So we need to set our expectations accordingly. Deep uncertainty means, and by deep uncertainty, just kind of remember the last time you felt deeply uncertain, right? Not just like, maybe, I don't know, but like, I'm not sure how that's going to turn out. And there's almost like an ominous sense that comes along with it.
We usually don't admit it to ourselves. We usually code it in something else.
Right. That's true. But
we don't like feeling this way.
We do not. And when we feel deep uncertainty, oftentimes most humans go into a place of neglect, right?
Or overcompensation for it.
Sometimes, but usually, I think the 10-year-old tends to be more overcompensating.
Yeah. I thought certainty in general. You're right. The 10-year-old, absolutely.
Right. As a general, I mean, I think most of us, when we feel a sense of ominous, deep uncertainty, we go into avoidance as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And so when we get to this part of ourselves, we need to set expectations according to that idea that this is a place of deep uncertainty. And so we need to be very reasonable and modest in the expectations we set here. So we'll walk through all 4 of these cognitive functions and talk about the expectations we can set for ourselves, what it looks like when we are at our best, and how that can be something that allows us to receive the love that we're always trying to give to ourselves.
Okay, so let's jump into more specifics. How can an ENTP show themselves love? Let's talk about the expectations of the driver, technically called the dominant cognitive function of extroverted intuition or exploration.
Yeah. So ENTPs need to have very high expectations for themselves in this function. This is the function that has the highest degree of certainty. It's the most associated with an ENTP's relationship to themselves. Our friend Dr. John Beebe says it's associated with hero energy, and it's part of the axis of relating to self, which basically means that this is the ENTP self-definition. If you ask them to describe themselves, a lot of times they'll spend 80% of their time describing the function of extroverted intuition or exploration.
Yeah.
So this is the water in which us ENTPs swim in. And so we need to have very high expectations for ourselves here. We can't rely on natural talent. We have to build skill in it. We have to increase our competence in this function over time. And this can be difficult to do. It's a function that already it encourages people to get out of their comfort zone, and it can feel uncomfortable to other people to be around it.
Disruptive is the word I think of.
Yes.
For other people. Like when an ENTP comes into your life and you're not ENTP, you're like, whoa. I mean, I'm okay with it. I also have this function, but most people are like, wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like a lot.
Yeah.
And so because it has disruptive energy, sometimes people with, ENTP preferences will throttle it. They'll have to smuggle it in. They might have been encouraged not to use this function very often. It's pattern recognition. It's intuition. And so it doesn't always have proof other than just the fact that you've put 2 and 2 together, right? You've made a connection. And so it can assert things that other people may not always, they might not always buy. They might go like, well, how do you know that? And so it's a function that sometimes has to be contended with despite other people's negative feedback.
Yeah.
And that makes it a little difficult sometimes to build genuine skill in it.
Yeah.
It's also a function that requires an ENTP to get out of their comfort zone, but in productive ways. So you can get out of your comfort zone by making, what the old timers would call blue comments, right? Like things that are maybe socially inappropriate, or by, saying things that other people don't expect. You can use the function to, stay up all night the night before a paper's due writing it, or by having a quick witticism, or, there's a lot of expressions of it.
Yeah.
But actually building skill in it requires getting out of your comfort zone in big ways. So one of the best skills an ENTP can teach themselves or learn is public speaking. You get up on stage, and particularly improvisational or impromptu speaking, where you have to rely on your intuition to know what the next right word is, right?
Yeah.
It's like that real-time pattern recognition, but it's also it's almost like when you experience it, it's like laying train tracks in front of a train that is in motion. And you have to trust that your intuition will give you the next right word. And if you do that around a bunch of friends or in just moments where you're impressing people with, I don't know, like learning a skill very quickly or whatever, there's not a lot of weight there. But skill development, actual skill development means that you have to have consequences. There
Yeah.
has to be like a big reward for doing it well. And public speaking is one of the contexts where you can set in front of you a situation that is weighty, that relies heavily on your intuition to come through for you.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'm taking away from what you're saying specifically that you listening or watching could tune into, you have talent here, and you have a lot of capacity if you're an ENTP with this function, this part of your mental process. I think what Antonia's speaking to is the contexts you find yourself, the higher stake contexts allow you to exercise this and bring more of yourself to the world. The expectation that you can do this in a professional setting, not just with some friends and cutting up and making jokes in a casual environment, but also what about a professional environment, stretching yourself to capacity in the context, not just the skill itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's also, you're speaking a little bit to maturity, the discretion of when to use this. And as you move through life and you mature, you're going to have you have a higher expectation of yourself and when you will showcase this energy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, ENTPs are going to use this function all the time, not just in, like you mentioned, in cutting up. I don't want to reduce it necessarily down to just like banter. We use it all the time. We use it in problem solving. We use it in brainstorming. We use it to come up with innovative solutions to problems that we experience. We use it to entertain ourselves. There's lots of different contexts to use this function. But we're talking about how to experience self-love with it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the areas that if we don't have high expectations for ourselves, then we'll do what everybody does, right? We're gonna sort of land at the lowest common denominator usage of it. And when we do that, we experience a disappointment in ourselves. Because extroverted intuition or exploration, when it's not particularly well developed, when we're just using it all the time, it's why ENTPs get a reputation for not having any follow through. It's why we get a reputation for things like, having shallow relationships, right? Like, and I don't just mean with people. I mean with ideas, with projects, right? We just kind of bounce from thing to thing. We don't have any follow through. We don't have any seriousness about, the things that are important to us. Well, we use it to get out of binds. We use it to navigate the world, to avoid responsibility.
Yes.
Right. And when we do that, we can feel the lack of reward in our life. We know that we are screwing ourselves over by not actually putting some weight to this. And so
I call this ambitiously lazy.
Yeah, that's a good one, right? Actually, there is some ambitious laziness to it, but I think it's actually more responsibility avoidance. It's a desire to not have to commit. And so I wouldn't even necessarily call it avoiding work. I would say it's avoiding commitment. It's avoiding like having to follow through on something. And when the function is, when it's not well developed, it finds itself being a bit of, it's like a forest fire. It just jumps from thing to thing. When there is skill developed there, when a person is putting weight on, and high expectations for how good this function can be and how it can show up in their life, well, now there is a sense of responsibility to the function even itself.
Yeah.
It's not just being innovative and then bouncing. It's like going, okay, things can be innovative, but only if they work. And only if there is, like a way to roll this out, not just to entertain myself with ideas, but actually to contribute to other people, to be a true problem solver, to be a visionary even. And then when an ENTP develops this aspect of the function, now there's no obstructions to feeling self-love. Now they're proud of themselves. Now they have something to show for it. And then it removes all of that, like, oh, I'm just an ENTP. I can't do things like other people do. I can't, like, all of these.
I can't listen to an hour and 20-minute podcast. It's too long.
Right.
They might tell themselves if you've made it this far.
I guarantee that there's going to be that comment.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
This also speaks to, I think we talk about this in the owner's manual for ENTPs, the course that we have. We talk about the function of extroverted intuition, exploration, and all its qualitative nature and the things you're speaking to. But There's also this firm fixation that ENTPs have too, this desire for unfettered freedom to a point where it becomes a problem. We talk about it in the owner's manual, and maybe we want to mention that here too. I think that can be an obstruction for self-love because it's that wildfire, jumping from project to project or thing to thing and never really settling on one. At the end of your life, you might look back, if your ENTP preferences, and go, what do I have to show for my life? Because I jumped, it was maybe interesting and I was always entertained, but I never actually built anything. And I think that needs to be mentioned as well.
Yeah. Well, and if you are unwilling to stick with anything, then poor use of the function can also deal with being overwhelmed by possibilities.
Yeah.
Because it's a possibility function. So what can I do with my life? You mean literally anything I set my mind to? Like anything I can figure out?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then that means why would I choose one if I have endless possibilities?
Yep.
And now I'm overwhelmed by them, and now I'm not actually accomplishing anything.
Yeah. Okay. So with the dominant function for everybody, but ENTPs of exploration, high expectations. We can expect a lot. If you're an ENTP listening or watching, you expect a lot from yourself in this function. This is important for you to lean into. And maybe expecting a lot isn't jumping fire and opening up a lot of loops. Maybe expecting a lot is pick one thing and really focus and develop a lot around that.
Yeah. Well, it's not letting yourself be lazy.
Yeah.
And going like, well, I'm just easily bored. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, join the club. Now, you're going to have to figure out a way to get to the other side of that as opposed to complaining about it.
Yeah.
It's no longer expecting the outside world to solve, to be wowed by you. It's expecting yourself to sell good ideas to other people before they get implemented. It's expecting yourself to be responsible. It's meeting the world halfway. I think when ENTPs are younger or when they don't really have this function properly developed, there's a lot of like, well, other people aren't taking my good ideas. Other people aren't understanding my value. There's a bit of almost like a whininess about it. And developing the function means, well, any sort of development is maturing. And so maturing the function means going, well, I have to meet people halfway. If I'm going to expect people to accept my innovative ideas and my problem solving solutions and all of my wonderful creative, concepts, I'm going to have to learn to articulate them in a way that gets other people excited.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to learn how to sell it. I'm going to have to market my ideas. And if I'm going to spend all this time and effort marketing an idea, then I'm going to have to pare them down to the best ones, because why would I want to back losers, right? Why would I want to back casual ideas that I haven't really put a lot of thought into? They were just like a throwaway thought, but I still thought they were good enough so that people should adopt them. So it's like, it's understanding the weight of life. It's understanding the responsibility of that even this function needs to be, sort of like tapping into.
Yeah. Okay. So I was kind of kidding about the hour and 20-minute podcast, but I do want to not have this be 3 hours. So let's just keep rolling along in that car model. Let's hit over to you speak about paring things down and focusing. Well, let's talk about the co-pilot for ENTPs. I mean, this is the part of an ENTP's cognition that it can do that. It can create frameworks and parameters around all of the possibilities of the world and can start to create mastery. Proficiency. It has a lot of capacity for mastering core concepts and frameworks and content. It's a great pairing to that extroverted intuition, that exploration process, because it helps the ENTP now decide what actually matters to them and what's important. So this also has high expectations for it, for the ENTP. Maybe not as high as the driver, but just almost as high.
Yeah. So the co-pilot function is what Dr. John Beebe would call the parent function, or at least it's associated with parental energy.
Yeah.
So we still want to have very high expectations for our co-pilot function, but we also have a tendency to use it or to have it sort of activated, you might say, in service of other people. So our driver function is it's a function that we need to have high expectations for, because we're going to be using it for ourselves all the time. And we also, we'll use it in behalf of other people, but it's more about a relationship to ourselves. The co-pilot function is more about a relationship to other people.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting when it comes to an introverted function, particularly introverted thinking or accuracy, which is, like you said, the function that's focused on logical consistency, right? It's One of the easiest ways to understand it is the function that likes math, right? And I don't mean all people who have this function like math. I just mean that it's sort of the math of thought. Like you mentioned, it's reducible down to ones and zeros, sort of the code of how we think. It's our belief structures and what makes sense to us. And as a function that is instinctively triggered in usefulness to others, it can come across, when it's not well developed, it can come across pedantic, argumentative, debating. It can think that it's its job to correct everybody else's thinking, and that its desire is to teach. But if it doesn't set sufficiently high expectations for itself, then the quality of content that it has to teach might be actually pretty low.
Yeah.
It needs to be radically honest with itself. That's actually how it develops. And those of us that have ENTP preferences need to have high expectations of our ability to be radically honest with ourselves, to not just run around and tell everybody how their thinking is wrong, but to consider how our thinking is wrong. This function, one of the things that it does for us as a service is it encourages us to question our premises. Sometimes that's obnoxious to everybody else to endlessly question premises. But for us as introspective people, it's important to question premises like, I'm always right.
Us ENTPs you're talking about.
Right. Well, I mean, all humans use this function. And
Sure.
that's one of its big values and gifts to everybody when they're using the function. But for people with ENTP preferences, we need to be doing it all the time. We need to be questioning our own premises all the time and reevaluate what we think we know. We need to be willing to be wrong. When this function is well developed, we have a more accurate self-perception. We're not lying to ourselves. We're not lying to other people. We're not hoping that, we can do kind of a bit of a smoke and mirrors show, and everybody will think that we're more competent than we actually are.
So let's look at a real world scenario here. An ENTP who is out there, and even maybe it's not debating or trolling people on the internet. It's genuinely contributing and helping refine thought and servicing everybody else. But then when it comes to themselves, they're like, I can kind of fudge the numbers here, quote unquote. Maybe it's a little inconsistent. Yeah, my logic is flawed, but I'm going to just keep going anyway. What I hear you saying is that erodes an ENTP's ability for self-love, because it has a block or an interruption in the relationship with self. You're not holding yourself to a high account. You're not giving yourself any sense of like measuring up. Like, I'll just let myself off the hook. I'm going to hold everybody else. I'm going to help teach everyone else, but I'm not going to turn this on myself.
Yeah. Well, and we can tell instinctively. Everybody can kind of tell when they're lying to themselves. But for ENTPs, it's particularly painful. So if we're not registering it, if we're not acknowledging how we're lying to ourselves, and that could just mean, again, an inaccurate self-perception. It could be believing we're smarter than we are, or believing we're more capable. It's the old, I could do that, I just don't want to. It's like, if we're lying to ourselves, there's a wounding that happens. It's like a cut. And the less proficient an ENTP is with this function, the less of actual service they are to others. It's hard to figure out how to use introverted thinking or accuracy as a parental function. It really is. Even as a parent, even as like the mother of a daughter, sometimes it feels like I'm doing too much lecturing. Sometimes it feels like I'm, trying to help her understand logic that's beyond her years. It can be very difficult to really be of service with this function, but we have to master it. We have to figure out how to do it, because it's part of how we show ourselves love is by contributing with this function. That's our self-esteem takes a hit if we try to help others by being accurate, by using introverted thinking, and everybody else rejects it. That's also a wound. So one of the things I recommend is figuring out how your logic works. And I don't mean, it starts with understanding how logic works at all. So studying things like formal logic and studying, the patterns of how people create belief structures and that sort of thing is it's extremely helpful. But building skill means recognizing that this is a subjective function and everybody has their own sense of logic. When you see an ENTP run around correcting everybody else and telling them that their thinking is flawed, you can tell this is a person who hasn't done a lot of their own reflection on this, because there's a mechanism to how logic works at all. And once we I don't know, get to the coding of our mind, to the fundamental principles of how we have constructed our worldview and our paradigms. Once we get to that point, we go, there is a subjective nature to all of this. There is, like, a lot of this is built on my personal experiences and the belief structures that were given to me way before I knew to vet them properly.
The words in the language you speak
Mhm.
shape your mind as well and your thought processes.
You got
The
it.
type of definitions we use.
Exactly. And so when you're talking to somebody else and being unnecessarily insulting of how they're thinking, it's because you haven't yet cracked the code of how logic works in a subjective way. And so if we do that for ourselves, if we self-parent first and we understand our own mind's structure of when it decides to believe something or not, what are the premises that it never questioned, and how can it question those premises now? What is actually like the true laws of logic? Once you self-parent with this function, when you talk to somebody else, you're not just telling them that they're wrong or that the thinking is flawed. You can listen for the style of logic that person's subjective mind has created. It's almost like everybody's got a different algorithm running. And once you do that, then you're not just telling them that they're wrong, you're helping them calibrate how they're thinking about it. And then they can come to their own conclusions, because this is not a results focused function, it's a process function. It's about the process of how we think, not the conclusions we've come to. So helping other people understand how to think as opposed to what to think, helping other people, vet the things that they believe a little bit more carefully, recognizing that not everybody has to be totally accurate in every way. They just need to be able to, to determine what's good and bad code effectively.
Yeah.
This is how an ENTP can serve others.
Man, I think this energy, and I know we need to move on and keep rolling here, but I would think this energy is so useful right now at the dawn of the AI age and postmodernism, because it gets into kind of the subjective nature of belief and logic. And if we have a postmodern framework in our world, the old ways of thinking that are modernistic, like it's A plus B equals C, this is more flexible, it's more dynamic, it's more emergent. It can flex and flow with a lot of different, data sets and nodes and people. I think introverted thinking is the process built for the modern and the future world that's emerging every day. So I actually am really excited about this. And I think specifically ENTPs can help guide us there, can help parental energy us into the future. So I think that you figuring this out for yourself, if you're watching or listening along, and creating a good relationship with this part of you, showing yourself love, it's only going to make that part of you even more contributive, have more possibility to give, help guide us through this coming world that we're going to need you to help us with as an ENTP.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of debate right now about what truth is.
Yeah.
And what you can, what's real news and what's not.
Yeah.
Where you can trust your sources and what sources you can't trust. And
we need good thinking. It's desperate. We need good thinking.
That's the antidote. The antidote isn't saying that person is trustworthy or not trustworthy. The antidote is going, this is how you think cleanly.
Yeah.
And once you think cleanly, then you can determine for yourself whether or not to trust certain sources. And then it's also not just trusting people. It's like trusting your own mind's ability to call out bullshit, basically, to go, that's not consistently logical.
Yeah.
And doing that for yourself. And I think one more piece I'd add to this is that there is an absurdist element to introverted thinking or accuracy. It understands that at a fundamental core principle level, everything is absurd. And so there's a sense of humor about it as well.
Yeah.
And if this function is developed and mature, weirdly enough, it's in some ways more serious and in other ways less serious. Just like extroverted intuition or exploration has a reputation for being unserious, but when it's developed, it takes it kind of becomes more serious. Introverted thinking starts out serious and then it kind of lightens up over time.
Yeah.
And so well-developed ENTPs, they're people who understand what context they should show up serious and what context that they need to be a little bit more lighthearted. And in that way, people tend to like them more, right?
Yeah.
They're not just disrupting the vibe of every situation because they're bringing whatever entertains them. They have a little bit better read on situations, which goes into the next function we can talk about.
Yeah. Well, you teed me up, so I
Okay.
can tee you up. Here we go. So this is a transition moment. Had you not said that, I would have said, okay, so speaking of that, well, let's talk about that part of the ENTP, extroverted feeling or harmony. This is the part of the ENTP's cognition or mentality that's tied into other people. It reads the social cues. Now, the challenging news is the uncertainty that comes with this process for ENTPs. They are not certain here when they show up with this function. Harmony is something that they have a sense of capacity for, but always this question, am I doing it right? Am I pissing people off? Am I humiliating myself? Am I part of the group? And then there's a lot of other like workarounds where they assure themselves and have some overconfidence to tamp down any of that uncertainty. So even if you're listening or watching right now, you're like, I never experienced that uncertainty. Well, maybe.
Yeah,
I think you do. You've just convinced yourself you're not.
Then you need to be doing more introverted thinking or accuracy.
If you're not uncertain, maybe it's a good indication of something. So when we talk about self-love here, though, that's really the framework. Let's zoom in on the self-love part. Expectations. How should we think about expectations from this part of an ENTP's self?
Yeah. So any part of us that is just pre-wired to be uncertain, we need to have reasonable expectations around. Because again, we humans, we conflate uncertainty with a red flag. So anything that feels uncertain, we have a tendency to shy away from. And while we are not as deeply uncertain in this function as we are, say, the 3-year-old function that we'll talk about in a moment, there is uncertainty here. Now, Dr. John Beebe would call this the other side of the axis of relating to others. So just like the co-pilot of introverted thinking or accuracy is a parental function, this is what's called an eternal child function, or that's its energy that it tends to associate itself with. So the way that we all deal, no matter what our 10-year-old function is, the way that we deal with that uncertainty is by seeking approval from other people, by going, did I do it well? And if the person goes, yep, you did it well, then we feel like we got our head pat and we feel like we're going to be okay. It's like, okay.
Man, this is an insidious part, though, because not only positionally for all personality types does the 10-year-old, or technically called the tertiary process, look for approval. For ENTPs, harmony specifically looks for approval in a social environment.
Yep.
And disapproval to know whether it's doing well or not. So it's a double whammy for ENTPs here.
Yep. Yeah, we double up on our approval seeking with this function.
Yeah.
And there's a I would almost say like a predetermined striving for charisma that ENTPs like come out of the hatch feeling like we just feel compelled to be charismatic. We feel compelled to be liked. And it can turn into people pleasing tendencies. Now, not all ENTPs see that about themselves, particularly if they're young, because they see themselves as these sort of like disruptive renegades that'll say anything in any situation, right? Because they're trying to entertain themselves if they're bored, or they're willing to be the person who says something out loud. And when it comes to strangers, right, it usually is once you get out of the teenage time period where you're like mortified by everything and worried that you're going to be embarrassed all the time. Once you get out of that phase, there is like a renegade part of an ENTP. There is a part that will almost say anything, say, do anything for a laugh almost. But as you age, as the ENTP ages, they might find themselves in their relationships or in job contexts or, anything that is part of their personal ecosystem. They might find themselves handing over too much power to other people because they don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. They want to stay in that vibe. Extroverted feeling or harmony is a function that at its core nucleus fundamental is about understanding the energy that passes between humans, right? Two people. And when you are honed in on and tuned into that energy, you don't really want to disrupt the vibe. You don't want to disrupt that energy, particularly if it's positive. So ENTPs can, in their attempt to seek approval that they're doing it well, they can be less disruptive than they should be sometimes. As in, they might think things that they're unwilling to share with others, or they might allow themselves to be in a bad situation for way longer than the expiration date on maybe that job or that relationship, which is not usually the reputation that ENTPs have. In that fear of commitment, they'll, it's like, well, they'll bounce from thing to thing. But then when they choose something, sometimes they won't do what's in their own best interest because they finally made a decision or a choice and now they feel trapped by it. So this can be a function that is actually quite undermining to ENTPs. They might be highly charismatic and fun and have a good vibe with people, but then find themselves also being people pleasers or handing too much of their mimetic power over to others. So which all creates obstructions to feeling self-love, right? If you won't leave a bad situation, it's really easy for your brain to go, well, maybe you don't feel like you deserve to.
Yeah, we have so many coaching clients that are ENTP that have come to group coaching, one-on-one coaching, workshops. I mean, a lot of them have found themselves in this situation where they weren't willing to leave a situation that wasn't good for them. And they come into and eventually they enter our world after they've finally made the cut and they finally got out of the bad situation, the social situation, the relationship, whatever it is.
Career, right.
And they're so frustrated. They've given away so much of themselves. Mm-hmm. And there is a retraining of self-love for those ENTPs going, you know what? I have to learn how to love myself again because I can't believe I didn't stand up for myself. I can't believe I allowed that to happen. I can't believe I knew better. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it's really hard. A lot of grief, a lot of a challenge there, I think, for ENTPs that have come through that.
Yeah, for sure. So then how do you, what expectations should we set for this part of ourselves? And then how do we use it as an expression of self-love?
Yeah.
Well, the expectation is that we can be compassionate people, right? There's a reputation ENTPs sometimes have for being harsh, and it's well-deserved. We can be quite harsh, especially when we're kidding around or laughing with people. I mean, 100% of ENTPs have had that moment when they said the wrong thing and they thought everybody would laugh and they looked around and it was just crickets.
Yeah.
So that's just the thing that's going to happen. And it's probably going to happen till the day we die. I personally have not figured out how to not have that experience happen. Happens a lot less now, but we can be more tapped in and attuned to the energy of a room to be able to read the social context better. We can get better at it. That's a reasonable expectation. We can be compassionate people who read others with empathy. That energy that that's going back and forth between people carries with it information about the other person. Oftentimes it communicates the needs that the individual is having. It communicates how they're doing, right? Whether their morale is at, what they're feeling, what their experience is. And we can get sensitive to that. We can get sensitive to what the other person is going through. Now, when we give that too much power, sometimes we allow the other person's experience to overshadow our experience, and then that's when we're handing power over. But you can read that energy without feeling obligated to it. You don't have to always take a childlike stance when you read that energy from another person. It's not always our job to do something about it. Sometimes it's just a piece of information that we've received. So when we take this feeling energy and we do what's called integrate it into our thinking energy, meaning that we take harmony, extroverted feeling, and integrate it into introverted thinking or accuracy, we understand how to communicate difficult truths in a compassionate way.
Yeah.
And it's how we serve others. Remember, this is our axis of relating to others. So this is our contribution. We can contribute to other people by helping them see things that they themselves want to see. When a person communicates the truth, like a complete truth, the result is usually relief, not offense. And when you get really good at understanding how other people are thinking, understanding their subjective logic and why they're thinking the way they are, the process of how they're thinking, the things that they are not letting themselves think, like the truths that they're avoiding, which almost everybody is avoiding some truth. And then you merge that with a sense of compassion for the person, not judgment, not thinking that they're bad or stupid or whatever for thinking that way, but a compassion for how they got there. And what is the piece of information that they need to know? Or what's something that you can point out that would create relief? You become almost like the brain version of, the old fable of pulling a thorn out of the lion's paw, right? Most people are the lion with a thorn in their paw, and they're in pain, and they're roaring because they're in pain. And when you're really good at integrating these two functions into each other, you have this capacity to pull those thorns out and cause people, and it hurts while you're doing it, but it causes great relief to others. And now they have gratitude. Now you didn't have to be charismatic and charming. You didn't have to do the old dog and pony show. All you had to do was bring the best of your talents out and showcase them for the other person. And they were the beneficiary of it. And now you watch yourself do true contribution.
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that integration part with the 10-year-old tertiary into the co-pilot or auxiliary. If you're looking through your, let's say your ENTP owner's manual course, we talk a lot about that co-pilot, that auxiliary of introverted thinking accuracy. We're like, grow your co-pilot, focus on that. That's the biggest bang for your buck. As an ENTP, all types growing their co-pilot's the key lever. But we really focus in on that because we think that helps balance out the flow in your life, put you in that flow state along with your driver. You're moving through the world being able to pattern things and then question those premises like you talked about. But the problem is, the challenge here is that when you're in that function, the accuracy function, almost imagine a coin on a table. And imagine there's a polarity connection between introverted thinking accuracy and extroverted feeling harmony. Those two functions have a relationship with each other. And when you're in the energy of one, it almost like shuts off the energy of the other. So when you're in that accuracy part, really thinking deeply, you're focused, you're thinking about logical consistencies, you're not really in that vibe energy of connecting with people. And when you're in the vibe energy of connecting with people and you're social, you may not be looking for the hard truths and the details and the logic. Now, both are available to you, but usually you're in one energy or the other. What you're talking about, Antonia, integrating these together, it's almost like, like if you had a coin and you had one side down, you could only see the top of the coin. If you flip it, you see the other side, but you can never see what's underneath. Integrating them is almost like putting the coin and spinning it. And as it's spinning, it's hard to tell which function is being displayed because it starts to blend and merge. You see it so quickly. It's oscillating so fast. That's the relationship between the 10-year-old and the co-pilot we're talking about, you're referencing here. That in proper operation, in proper balance, that is really powerful for showing your self-love, because now you're, like you said, showing up with the compassion, the precision with the compassion. I think people really rest into that. So, and you yourself can rest into that. Not only do you bring that to others, pulling that thorn out of the paw, let's say, you can do that for yourself now. Yeah, you have the capacity to turn that toward you and say, I need to show myself love by confronting a hard truth with compassion, guiding myself through this difficult situation. Yeah, I need to hear some really hard truths from myself to myself, showing myself love through that mechanism. But I also have this part of me that understands compassion and understands what humans need to hear and how it has to land. Well, I can do that for myself too. Turn off the criticism voice, turn on the calibration voice, and then weave that harmony in to season all of those recalibrations for the self. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, or is that too abstract or too all over the place?
No, it totally makes sense. And like we mentioned before, feeling self-love is removing obstructions. Mm. And one of the obstructions that we can have as ENTPs is nobody values my talents.
Yeah.
We feel like maybe people like us or that we're fun or whatever. And maybe you're fortunate enough as an ENTP to be in a job or a career that uses your capacity to brainstorm well or problem solve or be innovative. But it's really rare for an ENTP to be thanked for their capacity to help people with their thinking processes specifically. Yeah. Like to calibrate their mind or to think better. And sometimes it does work out. Like sometimes you're highly prized for your thought process if you're in like STEM or some other field like that. But oftentimes we feel like people don't really value this part of us, right? Yeah. And one of the obstructions to feeling self-love is believing that we're not contributing with our greatest talents or greatest skills. And when we're able to master this integration, Carl Jung called it the transcendent function. It's taking two sides of the same function, the polarity, in this case, introverted thinking accuracy and extroverted feeling harmony, and turning them into a single thing, just like you mentioned, that coin spinning. And when we figure out how to do that, we watch ourselves contribute on like this elevated level. And now we go, no, I am a contributor. I am somebody who brings my talents to the world. And that, like, there's no obstruction there. It's so easy to feel self-confidence and self-trust, knowing that you're not sitting on your talents, right? You're building skill, you're doing better, you have high expectations for yourself and your co-pilot, and then you have reasonable expectations in your 10-year-old. You're not expecting that everybody will always like you. That's not a reasonable expectation for extroverted feeling or harmony. You're not expecting that everybody will, that you can please everyone. You're not expecting that you're going to be this natural caretaker and that you're always going to be the kindest person ever. None of those are reasonable expectations, but you can expect to deliver important information with a sense of compassion.
Yeah.
That is a reasonable expectation. And so now you aren't disappointed in yourself. Now you actually are building a lot of self-confidence.
And I think the other expectation you can have is you can expect your 10-year-old or tertiary to surrender to the co-pilot or auxiliary. If there is a conflict within the self, the part of you that's like, okay, the mature part of you is like, okay, 10-year-old, you need to go ahead and capitulate to the accuracy part. That actually needs to be driving the ship.
Yep.
And that's a good expectation. And when you don't expect that from yourself, I think that erodes self-love as well.
Yeah. Nobody will tell you this, but as an ENTP, you need to set aside compassion for rigorous logic.
Yeah.
Now, if you are not doing rigorous logic, if you're being lazy with your introverted thinking or accuracy and you're just being a jerk, well, then you should probably lean more on compassion, because being a jerk is never better.
Well, it's not logical to be a jerk.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
There's no reason for it, even though we have a tendency to kind of be a bit pedantic and have to learn that over time. But if we are truly developing that part of ourselves with high expectations, then that is the voice that should win. The thing that makes sense to me, the thing that is logically consistent in my mind after I've honed my processes and done as much removing of cognitive biases and removing of my own cognitive dissonance, when my self-perception is calibrated, when all of those things are there, then the compassion we have for people can sometimes get us in trouble if we hand too much power of thought over to them. And so nobody will tell you this, but your compassion, which leads you to want to adopt other people's ways of thinking, that actually needs to be throttled in behalf of your rigorous intellectual processes. And when that happens, you find yourself actually being able to have enough room for compassion too. It's just in its proper, it's properly balanced.
Okay. So let's go back review. Driver, high expectation. Co-pilot, fairly high expectation. 10-year-old tertiary, moderate expectation here for yourself.
Reasonable expectation.
Reasonable. And it should be in service to the accuracy for ENTPs, the co-pilot or auxiliary. Let's talk about that 3-year-old, what's technically called the inferior cognitive function for ENTPs. Memory is our nickname, introverted sensing. What's the proper expectation here? I mean, this is a part of an ENTP maybe they don't like to look at all the time. It's deeply uncomfortable, deeply uncertain. So, like, if I'm not looking at this, if you're an ENTP watching or listening right now, and you're not looking at this part of yourself, or you're pushing it away, or you don't have a good relationship with this part of yourself, you are obstructing self-love. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
So how do we undo the blocks here? How do we have a proper or how does an ENTP have a proper relationship with this specific part of themselves?
Yeah. So this is the other side of what John Beebe would call the axis of relating to self. So it's the other side of extroverted intuition or exploration. It's the other side of the polarity. And it also has a coin heads or tails style relationship. When one is turned up, the other one is usually face down, and vice versa. And we like extroverted intuition or exploration a whole heck of a lot more than we like the sensing function. And when we're in this function, we feel deeply uncertain, which again, we always interpret as a red flag. So it's very easy for ENTPs to not develop this part of themselves, to use it as little as possible, to not really like descriptions of it, and to marginalize its significance and importance.
This is the part of you that will put down roots, stabilize, stay with something over a long period of time until you see the results from it. We were talking about earlier that dominant, you want to jump like a wildfire. This is the part of you that helps you not do that. Mm-hmm. But you're uncertain, you want to avoid it.
Right. Like, what if I choose the wrong one?
Exactly.
When you talk about getting stuck in the wrong situation, it's oftentimes, and I've been here before myself, it's because I didn't actually make a choice. And so life made one for me. And then I got stuck in this choice that it feels like wasn't my choice at all. And so introverted sensing or memory is making a choice to stabilize, to commit, right? And it's the part of us that has deep respect for institutions. If an ENTP never shows or develops any sort of respect for what came before, for institutions, for standards, then they will find, like you mentioned, they'll find themselves at the end of their days looking back and not having accomplished much because we don't really accomplish that much all by ourselves. We always have to plug ourselves into something in order to gain traction, in order to gain ground. So a reasonable expectation for an ENTP is that this function is always going to feel deeply uncertain. And it's a function that wants certainty. That's the other part of it. That's what makes it so difficult. Is it's a function that wants to be certain. It's a function that wants to reference back, well, how did other people do it? It has a tendency to like what I call borrowed wisdom. It likes experience. It likes people who have experience. It tends to rely on its own experience, right? Like I've done that before, so now I know how that works. If I haven't, then I'm going to seek somebody who has clocked a lot of hours doing this or has done a lot of research. And it doesn't have as much honor of innovation or outside the box quick thinking or things that just came up. Like it doesn't really like the idea of laying train tracks in front of the train while it's in motion. It wants to have had those tracks laid for a long time, tested, and then we put the train on the tracks. So it's everything an ENTP sees as the opposite of their strengths. And yet it can also, just like that 10-year-old can be integrated into the co-pilot, it can also be integrated into the driver function. So a reasonable expectation. So the unreasonable expectation is that you're going to love it. The unreasonable expectation is that you're ever going to feel a sense of certainty in it, even though it itself would like you to feel certain. And an unreasonable expectation is that you're ever going to be the kind of person who has everything together, just like you see the people around you, right? Everybody else, man, they have their routines. They get to the gym at the same time every week. They never are late to pick up their kids from school. How do they schedule all these things? Like, that's just never going to be you, right? It's just never going to be us. We have to acknowledge and understand that even if we want that to be our life at a certain point, it's probably not going to roll out that way. But we can develop respect for timelines. We can develop respect for institutions. We can make commitments and choices and root ourselves in these choices and then bear fruit. This is a function that understands planting at one season and then harvesting in another season. It understands that you have to stick with things, that we're not just always nomads. That if we're going to bear the fruit of our hard work, then we're going to have to stay with that hard work and we're going to have to see it through all the way to the end. It encourages us to finish strong, to not just start something, but also be there for the conclusion of it. So we can do all of that. We can develop that ability to think seasonally. We can develop the ability to at least attempt to lay down roots and tracks. And when we do that, now we find ourselves a lot more effective in our innovation. We're not just people who come up with good ideas. We're people who see those ideas through.
Well, it also supports the ENTP's thinking, because if you have roots and you've got stability, you can go deeper into deeper work and focus. You can actually stretch your mind, the capacity of your mind, if it's built off of a substrate of stability, you have more access. So this actually supports also co-pilot development or auxiliary development in the ENTP's personality. Stabilizing allows you the focus time you need for accuracy or introverted thinking, which makes your whole life better also. So it all works together, and these are personality dynamics we're talking about. The reason why it's not just one thing you do in your personality is all of these influence each other. And I think it gives you capacity for more self-love in the parts of an ENTP, like deep focus, like understanding core principles, like coming up with whole new concepts and ways of thinking we haven't thought of yet. I think it's an awesome process.
Yeah. Well, it helps us also with grounding. It like grounds us and helps us understand the importance, not just of what's coming up, but what is happening now.
Oh, you could stay with a podcast for an hour and 20 minutes.
You could stay with the podcast
the whole way through using this process.
Listen, as an ENTP, if I can actually make a podcast for over 10 years, I'm sure somebody can listen to a podcast for 60 minutes plus.
On double speed.
On double speed is fine. But that said, no, it's true. It's like, it's the development of patience.
Yeah.
Right. And
focus, patience,
patience, commitment, being willing to stick with something. And I think in a very practical, like non-abstract way, ENTPs show themselves love with this function by taking care of their health.
Yeah.
Right. By doing maintenance things, by even if it's not the same time every time, making sure you hit the gym, right? Making sure that you're eating good food, making sure that you're paying attention to those things. Last year was it was a terrible year for us, right? We haven't really talked about it on the podcast, but last year was practically devastating. for multiple different ways.
It almost wiped out our family, business, everything. Like it wasn't like death or anything. It was just really challenging, and a bunch of things that had been set up were almost ready to fall apart. We caught them right at the last minute.
I used to have 2 worst years of my life, and now I have 3 worst years of my life. The first one was when my sister died. The second one is when I left my religion and my best friend died. And last year was number 3.
There you go.
So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about like a devastating year. And of course, the first thing that dropped was my attention to health. I think I gained probably like 12 pounds last year, something insane like that. If you look at the podcast, you can see at the beginning of the year, I'm at a certain size. And then as the podcast goes, I get like a little chunkier and chunkier until eventually like midsummer, I look like I popcorned. And it's because I was just completely neglecting my health. I was neglecting everything that I had, my introverted sensing or memory had laid roots for. Now I'm back, right, to attending to that stuff, but I could tell how undermining it was to my self-esteem. I could tell how undermining it was to my ability to feel confidence in myself. Not just because of my size, it was actually more the fact that I was ignoring and neglecting myself. I was doing bad things to my body. Bad processes, bad habits, all those things. I was staying up way too late. I was, like not getting enough sleep. I was stressed out. It was like the whole system had been shaken to its core. And I had not realized how much integration of introverted sensing or memory I had done over the last decade, until they all just tumbled last year. And then I felt like I was like a ship being thrown about in the ocean. I had no ballast. Everything was up in the air. And it reminded me how critical and important it is to integrate that part. I could barely create content. I feel like I wasn't doing as good of a job in coaching. Like everything was destabilized because I was destabilized. And so this is really that axis of relating to self is really a big piece of it. It's your relationship to yourself and how you're communicating to yourself that you're important, that you can prioritize yourself.
Yeah.
You're allowed to commit to your own health. And so I think in the abstract, it's about commitment in general and roots and harvest and all that stuff. But in a practical way, it's like taking care of your body and basic maintenance. And I've known of people with ENTP preferences that have gotten older and they've kind of beat their bodies to hell, right? Because they never prioritized it and they never thought it was important. And so I think that's like a practical application of integrating this 3-year-old function.
Yeah. Any other comments about the 3-year-old before we move on to, I want to get into what the rest of us can take away from ENTPs and their sense of self-love.
Yeah. Well, I just, as an overarching, the first thing is like, I do want to highlight the capacity for patience. When an ENTP thinks that they're constantly and perpetually bored all the time and life is boring and they need to have constant stimulation, this is the part of us that tampers, that throttles that need for constant stimulation. It's like, no, you can be patient. You can be bored. It's okay. You're not going to die. It's going to be fine. It's the ability to be steady, right? A steady person. And just holistically, the entire car model, right? All 4 of these functions. When we have proper expectations, we don't expect ourselves to do better than we're going to be able to, but we also have high expectations for the things that we have talent in. The word that I would say that ENTPs gain is a sense of discretion, right? We're not usually considered discreet people. And
really?
Yeah. And so this is a gift that I think is, it's hard to communicate how it facilitates everything.
Yeah.
Right. We have a sense of discretion around our thoughts. We have a sense of discretion around when we communicate things to other people and how we communicate them. We don't just assume that disruptive ideas are something that everybody needs to hear, whether they want to or not. We have a sense of discretion about which disruptive ideas are the good ones. We find ourselves contributing in a way that other people want to receive. There's just a lot of discretion that comes from this. And I think that we end up looking sober-minded and mature, just like everybody, right? Everybody that does any amount of personal growth or development finds themselves maturing rapidly. And when an ENTP removes all these obstructions for self-love, when they don't overdo their driver, but they have high expectations for the skill development, when they don't push their thinking off on other people, but they meet other people halfway, when they don't go into people pleasing or assuming charm is going to get them through, like anything, even being kind of a horrifically offensive person. when they have compassion and they truly are tuned into the other person to serve what their real needs are, not the bullshit needs that they think, but the real core ones. And when an ENTP develops patience and is willing to commit and be rooted and see the return on their investment, I think this is a mature person. And they're not going to look like they're not going to look like Rick from Rick and Morty. They're not going to look like Doc Brown. They're not going to look like, the Joker, like you mentioned. They're not going to look like these stereotypes of ENTPs. They're going to look like somebody who, maybe is a professional, or somebody who takes their work seriously, or somebody who can really show up as a friend. They end up becoming a person who is very high quality. That doesn't mean they lose their sense of humor. It doesn't mean that they lose their ability to have joie de vivre. It doesn't mean that they're never going to have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy. It just means that they're not going to look like the cartoon version of an ENTP.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I'm probably championing this a little bit is because it's very common for people to look at an ENTP that's mature and project a different type onto them, to go, oh, they can't be an ENTP. Because for some reason, everybody's like, okay, this is definitely me going off on a little bit of a tangent, but there is, I think, a lot of limiting beliefs that other people project onto ENTPs.
Oh, yeah.
That there is a maturity cap that we can't get beyond. And if we start showing up more mature, they start projecting different types onto us. Like, I can't tell you how many people have decided that I have ETJ preferences. Not anybody who listens to the podcast. If you listen to the podcast, anybody who listens to the podcast knows I have introverted thinking because I can't shut up. But
and you data dump.
And I data dump, and I do all the...
Well, the biggest indicator is you give out information that can be weaponized back against you.
Right.
Extroverted thinking, effectiveness, doesn't do that.
Yeah, they don't do that.
It's just that people that use that process are
Right.
like, no, I know information is weaponizable. I'm not doing that.
Exactly.
And you will.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the biggest thing.
But drive-bys, right? People who just listen to a couple, like a 60-second clip, or, a 10-minute chunk, or maybe a 5-minute interview somewhere else or whatever. It's very common for them to project extroverted thinking onto me. And I couldn't figure out why until I realized I think it's just because I show up like a professional.
Yeah.
Right. That's it. I'm just showing up as a professional that is serious about my craft. Oh, you must not be an ENTP. Right. And so there's a bit of me that gets kind of frustrated with the limitations other people project onto us. And I think that when ENTPs are full of self-love, when they remove these obstructions, when they have a good relationship with their axis of relating to self, healthy, and they're contributing with their axis of relating to others, I think that you see a high quality person in front of you. And I feel it's a shame that other people project onto them that they must be a different type, as if other types have the monopoly on maturity.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what the other personality types can learn from ENTPs about self-love. So there's 15 other types. I'm one of them. And as we look at ENTPs, you probably have an ENTP in your life in some capacity, whether it's a close, relationship, or somebody that you just are a colleague of, or in your work environment, or maybe you just know of somebody, you casually have a relationship, or you just know of somebody in your life. As you tune into their ability for self-love and look at their life and how they're showing up, what are some ways that we can learn from ENTPs? What are some ways that as any other type, we can say, okay, that's an ENTP that's showing them self-love. That's something I can take away from that environment and apply it to myself. I know, Antonia, you have some thoughts on this, so I'd love to dig into some of that, just to land the plane for other types that are listening right now.
Yeah, I hope I didn't throw it off too much. Did I get too personal?
No, I don't think you got personal. I think it's good to get personal. I think that I think that ENTPs sometimes try to depersonalize themselves.
I know.
Or they put themselves in a personal way, but only funny, like a caricature personality, but it's not like a real deep, this is how I feel. I often see them kind of avoiding that. It doesn't feel comfortable, I think.
Now my uncertainty, my introverted feeling is like, oh, you made it too much about you.
I think it's good to make it about you on this one.
All right.
It is your personality type, your best fit type.
That's right. And it's my podcast. I've been doing it for 10 years, so I'm allowed.
You're allowed to.
That's right. I've earned some liberties. So I think the quality, and it's going to go back to what I basically was just going on and on about, I call it altruistic gravity, which is understanding the gravity of thoughts, understanding the importance that thoughts have.
Talking about the stakes, like how high stakes they are?
It's not even high stakes. It's that they carry weight,
Okay.
right? It's like when
Deep
you
meaning.
Hmm?
Deep meaning then?
I guess it's like it's that concept that thoughts are things, right? And it's not really
Yeah.
it's not natural for introverted thinking to immediately associate thoughts as things because all the thinking happens inside. And so it's easy to play with concepts, right? It's like a
Yeah.
laboratory inside your mind. And not everybody feels that way. Not everybody thinks that. And so if you're just like, you're spitballing or you're just throwing ideas around or you say things that sound true in the moment, but you're not really sure if you stand by it, other people can adopt these thoughts from you. You can alter, there's a weight to what we say and how we articulate and
Yeah.
express. And other people can receive them and start thinking like we can actually impact how another person calibrates their mindset and their paradigms. So being cavalier with information, throwing it around, like not thinking of thoughts as things or as capable of becoming things in the outside world. This is when we hurt people's feelings
Yeah.
or we, get a reputation for not being particularly serious. But when we understand that thoughts also carry altruism, right? Like our paradigms, our ways of thinking, the processes of how we think, these impact society. They impact more than just ourselves. And if we can be models for good thinking, for clean thinking, and especially since we are actually pretty good at selling an idea, even if we get kind of an attitude like people aren't taking our ideas, the truth is that extroverted intuition can be very persuasive. It can really sell a thought.
Yeah.
And so if we are not doing our if an ENTP does its due diligence, if it is understanding the weight of thoughts and it is selling the right ideas, it has the ability to impact untold numbers of people for the positive. It's a form of altruism when we have clean processes. So I think the quality is altruistic gravity of thought, the weight around the process of thinking and how that can be a gift that helps society in a major way.
So what I hear you saying then is clean thinking down to its components, like its core principled thinking is the building block of reality. And if we've got good core principled thinking, we're going to have a good reality, a good life, a good experience. But often people are sloppy with this. And as an ENTP, again, I'm inferring some things here. I'm going to project some things. You tell me if I'm on what you're trying to talk about here from this perspective. If an ENTP is cavalier with the building blocks of thought and they're throwing things around and they're not letting people know, look, I'm just ideating here. I'm just thinking, I'm just playing around with concepts. You don't write this down. I hear you say that sometimes on coaching or a podcast or whatever. You're just playful with it. But a responsible ENTP will say the thinking that I put in stuff, I'm just playing with this, but this thinking here is actually important. It is a building block of reality because it is a core component thought. You can help shape how people's thought processes are and how our world emerges, where a lot of people just throw around ideas, generalities. They're not clear on their definitions. They conflate things. And so as an ENTP, you listening or watching right now, you might have a bespoke, unique positional opportunity to contribute to the world by helping us not be cavalier with thought, but instead be careful with thought.
Yeah.
Still fun and playful, still tuning into the absurdity of some of it, still understand the human component because you have to have a relationship in context with thought, right? You can't just we're not all just ones and zeros. People have emotions and things, and I think ENTPs can understand that. A mature ENTP has this capacity to bring that gravity of thought, right? This ability to kind of expand people's views, but with a fundamental understanding of how the process works.
Yeah, and this goes against the stereotype. This is an unusual trait because it goes against the stereotype that a lot of people have of ENTPs as trolls. And trolling is the opposite of altruistic gravity.
Yeah.
Like arguing with people online to tell them that they're stupid or to just try to evoke a response so that a person will see the sloppiness of their thinking without it having a compassionate frame.
Yeah.
This is what ENTPs have a reputation for.
Sure.
But when they are well developed and mature, they actually do the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Right? They're not trolls. They're the opposite of trolls. They're thought leaders.
Yeah.
Personally, I've had ENTPs in my life that have been thought leaders that have been extremely inspiring for me.
Yeah.
So it's a quality, a characteristic, and a trait that I'm always aspiring to.
Yeah. So it's a non-obvious avenue for self-love for the ENTP. If you're an ENTP that's tuned into that, you probably have a lot of self-love because you have to be able to give in that way. So what I take away from that to learn is to say, yeah, I have a cavalier nature to how I talk and throw ideas around, but maybe there's something to learn from more mature ENTP energy that's more careful with the thinking, more careful with the process. I can attune to myself. You listening right now, if you're not ENTP, that's also, I think, a takeaway. But I'd like to hear more. If you're coming up with other things as we're talking about this, whether you're an ENTP or another type, love to hear from you. It's just been me and Antonia talking about ENTPs showing themselves love. There's not been a third microphone here, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. And directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story, whether you're an ENTP or not. What is coming up for you as we talk about this in this episode? What are the challenges that are emerging for you? What are some of the ahas, the connections and insights? Where do you still feel like you struggle with this idea of showing yourself love, especially if you're an ENTP? Again, come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You might be watching us on YouTube because you can also subscribe to us on our video podcast channel on YouTube. And if you leave a rating, review, or a comment on any of those platforms, we're very, very, very grateful. I especially am grateful. Whenever you leave a rating and review on iTunes or on some of the other platforms, I get warm and squishy because I have extroverted feeling or harmony as a 10-year-old. That means I'm uncertain and I need your feedback to let me know that I'm doing well. And I'm contributing to society, right? That's part of my self-love. And if you have not yet grabbed a copy of the ENTP Owner's Manual, I highly recommend it. We've been talking about the car model this entire episode. That is a at-home study course that walks through the car model and all of the phenomena that you're going to need to know to become the absolute best version of yourself as an ENTP.
Yeah.
The different type dynamic phenomena that will undermine you, that will be an obstruction to you feeling self-love, and all of the strategies to get to the other side of that. So come over to personalityhacker.com and pick up a copy of the ENTP Owner's Manual.
Yeah, that Owner's Manual is really powerful for every one of the 16 personality types. So it really doesn't matter your type, whether you're ENTP or not. Come over and join one of those courses for your type to get started. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.